So here I am back in the diagram, and the first thing that we're going to create in this application is the controller. Controllers are used to establish a connection between the client and the application. So the first controller that we'll be creating is the user controller, which will handle auth and user related requests. So let's head over back to Spring Boot and get started on that. All right, so here I am back in IntelliJ, and what I want to do is I want to right click on the controller folder, hover over new, select Kotlin class/file, and over here I'm going to write user controller and make sure that you select class. And what it should do is it should create a class called user controller for you. Now what I want to do is I want to establish in this class the routes or the endpoints that will be creating that will allow the clients to hit an endpoint to communicate with the application. Now there's multiple ways to go about doing this, and I'm going to show you an initial way, and then I'm going to show you a better way. So first, what we got to do is we got to provide annotations. Annotations are very big in Spring Boot, right? It makes our lives a lot more easier. So the first annotation I'm going to use is the @controller annotation. So this controller annotation allows for the auto scan of the class to inform Spring Boot that this class is going to be a controller class. This is where our endpoints are going to be stored, and this is where you can, take a request and try to see if it matches any of our endpoints that we have in our controllers. And I gotta first spell it correctly first, so controller. And then it's gonna ask you, do you want to import it? And yes, I do, from the Spring Boot framework.stereotype. So like I said, this is going to inform Spring Boot to scan our classes, if there's multiple classes or multiple controller classes, to find the right endpoint that the client sent from their application to our application to see if there's any routes or endpoints that match that name. Now, if there isn't, then the user will be informed that there's nothing that can process that request. But if there is, then it'll start the process of processing that request. Now we got to specify the endpoint. So if you know about APIs, you know that there's multiple verbs that we can use, right? You can use get, you can use post, you can use patch, you can use put, you can use delete, right? These are verbs that are often used to handle API requests. Now, the first endpoint that I'm going to create is the sign up endpoint, right? It's going to be very simple, but just to show you guys how it's established, I'm going to use a couple more annotations. So there's the @post mapping, which is going to handle post requests. And this is going to be coming from the Spring Framework.web.bind.annotation.post mapping, right? And we're going to have to open up some parentheses and open up some quotes and specify the form of the endpoint. So in my case, I'm going to do /sign up. So depending on the domain, right? And right now, this is going to be locally. So it's going to be localhost and some port. After that domain is going to be /sign up or whatever endpoint that you define. So if you do /login, then it's going to make sure that when it sees that, it's going to go to this piece, right? It's going to be like, okay, we have a /sign up. Let's go to that specific endpoint and we're going to process that request from here. So we got to define some more things to help process that information. But if you ever were to send anything with a /sign up, then it's going to make sure that it routes it to this endpoint. Then we got to define the function, right? This is what's going to help process that request, right? We're able to receive those requests based on if it's sent to /sign up, and it has to be a post request, right? If it's a get request to /sign up, then it's not going to be able to process it because we don't have right now a endpoint that's defined for get requests. We only have one that's defined for post. So that's important as well. And let me just define a function name for it. I'm going to call it sign up and open up some parentheses. Right now, I'm not accepting anything, but in the future we will. And to send back to the user, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return back a string, right? And I'm going to open this up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a string back because I said this function is going to return a string. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to say, hello world. And that's pretty basic when it comes to coding, right? And in the future, we're going to go about how we can structure specific responses and how we can send that back to client. We're going to run some logic beforehand, especially with sign up, of making sure that we take a request in, whether it's email, whether it's username, password, take all that information, make sure that it's in a proper structure, save it to the database, and then we'll return something back to the user. That's all in the future. But for now, this is how you create a sign up endpoint. Now, with using the controller annotation, what is expected that goes together with this endpoint is another annotation called at response body. And that comes from the same web.bind.annotation, but it's going to be the response body. Now, the controller annotation usually goes together with the response body annotation because as a request comes in and is processed, the response body annotation will return the data in a response body format. So like I said, there's multiple ways of creating an endpoint, right? Right here, I have controller annotation. I have the verb of the type of API request that this is going to accept and the name of the endpoint. And then I have the at response body annotation that specifies how to structure the response back to the user. But with Spring Boot, there's another way of doing this by first removing this response body annotation and removing this controller annotation and using the at rest controller annotation. And essentially what it does is it merges those two together. It merges the controller and it merges the response body annotation together. So instead of having to use two annotations, it just mixes into one. And there's a lot more things that this annotation does, but if you're using the at-rest controller annotation, then you don't need the response body annotation. It's already done or it's already merged inside of the annotation itself. So cool. Now we have already one endpoint, right? We have a very basic implementation of a sign up endpoint. So now we'll be able to handle requests or post requests specifically to any request that is sent to /sign up, right? So in our case, it's going to be localhost, and by default, Spring Boot runs on port 8080. So if we run this up and hit localhost 8080 and use /sign up, then we should expect to see hello world. And let me show that really quick. So let me go ahead and run this really quick. All right, and it already started up after a little while. And if I scroll a bit up, it'll inform you on what port is running, right? Because it's internally have a Tomcat server that spins up the application, and it shows you that Tomcat initialized with port of 8080. So now we can use localhost 8080 and specify a specific endpoint to communicate with our Spring Boot application. So let me switch over to Postman and I can show that really quick. All right, so here I am in Postman and I already have a whole bunch of routes predefined or already created before, but you don't need a request body to sign up. Remember, we created a very basic implementation. So if anything, I could just put none here. We don't need any headers yet, right? It should just be a clean um, post request, right? Make sure that it's a post request. It can be a get, and I'll show you guys what happens when you send a verb that is not expecting, but it's a post request to localhost 8080 /sign up. And if I press send, I get a hello world back, right? This is the response I received with a 200 status code. Now, if I try to do a get, it's going to get very angry at me. Method not allowed because there is no endpoint with that specific verb, right? There's only post. So if I send post, it's okay. But if I send get, then it's going to inform me that that method is not allowed. There is no endpoint with that verb. So that is our first endpoint, and there are many more that we're going to have to create, as you can see right here in this little collection here. But it's a good start. All right, so here I am back in IntelliJ, and what I want to also create a controller for is the funds controller, right? We'll create a funds controller to handle requests related to funds. So this is going to be a placeholder for now. Like we're going to dive in deeper into actually implementing the logic to process the request, but it's good to establish what type of endpoints we're going to need to handle the logic for our application in the future. So let me go ahead and do new Kotlin class, and I'm going to call this the funds controller. And then here I'm going to put the same at rest controller annotation to inform Kotlin that this is going to be holding some endpoints so that users can be able to reach out to our application if it matches the criteria. So I'm going to utilize another annotation here, but instead of using post like I did before, I'm going to use the get mapping because it's going to be able to handle get requests. And the first endpoint that I want to specify is /transaction. This is going to be the endpoint to be able to get all the transactions that are related to a specific user. So based on the token that is sent, it's going to grab that user ID in the token and is going to be able to retrieve the transaction specific to that user. But for now, it's going to be very basic of just returning a string. But I want to be transparent with you guys on what to expect in the future. So this is going to be a string for now. Open that up, just return get transactions. The second one is going to be a post request, or it's going to expect a post request. So I'm going to use a post mapping. And this is going to be /transaction /deposit. And this is going to be able to process or handle deposits, right? So you got money that you want to put into your account. This is going to be the route that you hit. And for now, placeholder of type string, and it's going to return a string of deposits. And just to save some time, just copy this because I'm going to also need another post request. And this one is going to handle withdrawal. So I'm going to change the function name to withdraw because that has to be unique. And I'm going to change this last piece of the endpoint to withdraw, right? Because this is just going to handle withdrawal. So if you have money that you want to take from your account, if you have enough money in your account, the balance is, greater than the value that you want to retrieve, then we're going to deduct that amount and provide it to you. So withdraw is going to be what is returned. Then you're also going to be able to handle transfers. So transfers from internal accounts, meaning if you have two accounts, then you're going to be able to transfer from account one to account two. So it's also going to be a post request, and I'm going to call this handle transfers or handle transfer. And I'm just going to return transfers as transfer as the name or the string that's being returned here. And then the last endpoint for this controller will be transaction /send, because you'll be able to send money to other accounts, another individual, if they exist, and if you have the proper amount. So handle send, and here I'm just going to put send as a string. So this is just a placeholder of the funds controller, right? You're going to have them for transactions, deposit, withdraw, transfer, and send.